World War II, clearly, with 12 million people involved in the armed forces, was clearly the pinnacle of American military involvement. Most people didn't realize this, but we were gearing up for war before Pearl Harbor. Munitions output had gone up 225%. In 1940, the Selective Service Act was passed, and then in 1941 it was repassed by Congress. Clearly, this was the greatest undertaking the United States had in terms of being involved in a conflict, in terms of the number of casualties in the conflict. Obviously the Civil War, almost everybody was a combatant, so particularly in the South. So even though there were 22 million people in the North and 11 million in the South, the 7 million white Americans in the South, were all engaged one way or the other because it was on their home soil. From the beginning of the war, the Allies, even before the war started, the British and the Americans agreed that Europe would be the key first. The key was to defeat Germany first, and then hold the wall against Japan, and then respond against the Japanese. The military, one of their slogans is "Hurry up and wait," and 90% of it or 80% of it is sitting around waiting for the invasion, and then of course the other 20% is all hell breaks loose. The United States traditionally has not been a society that has been expert in jungle warfare or in guerrilla warfare. And so the Marines and the Army that had to land on these islands were bloodied by those experiences. I mean, people, Tarawa, Iwo Jima were examples. Navy admirals said, about one of those islands, uncommon valor was a common virtue. So we were not terribly well prepared at the beginning of the war for jungle warfare, the heat, the disease, the rain, etc. As time went on, however, American expertise and industrial might managed to help turn the tide, that our troops were much better provided for than the Japanese troops, and the United States followed a policy of island hopping, meaning that what we did was we would capture certain islands and cut off the Japanese that were on the other islands, and the submarine force was able to help do that and slowly strangle the Japanese and make it impossible for them to get any supplies while the American supplies continued to flow. So again, Alexis de Tocqueville said that democracy takes a long time to mobilize, but once it mobilizes, you better watch out, because once it mobilizes, they're pretty successful. And he was right in World War I, and he was right in World War II. There's no doubt about that. Once we geared up, we were outproducing the Axis, at least 2-to-1. And that influx of planes and materiel helped our soldiers in terms of adjusting to what became bitter hand-to-hand combat in jungle warfare. Japanese sentiment among the generation of the greatest generation, those people who would now be in their late 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. It might still be a little bit, there might still be a little bit of lingering resentment. In 1991, when they had the 50th commemoration of Pearl Harbor, the person organizing it was asked, "Do you intend to invite the Japanese?" And his response was, "We didn't invite them then, and we're not inviting them now." And there are any number of people who will not buy Japanese products of that generation. Any number of people who believe that we are already engaged in an economic conflict, with Asian societies, whether it be China or Japan. So I mean, I think it is lessening. But the generation that would be my parents' age, for example, in that middle to late 80s, I would suspect there's still some sense of resentment, especially because of what happened at Pearl Harbor, but also during the course of the war. There was a real emphasis on anti-Japanese propaganda, and of course Japanese Americans were placed in internship camps, whereas German Americans and Italian Americans, for a whole lot of reasons, were not placed in those type of camps. At best, we were uneasy allies during World War II. At best. There's no doubt that American policymakers believed, as Churchill did, that if the devil were fighting the Nazis, we'd make a pact with the devil. The idea was to, which is what Churchill said, the idea was to defeat the Germans and the Japanese first and then deal with the Russians. Stalin was named Times Man of the Year in 1943, I think, and Roosevelt sometimes referred to him as Uncle Joe. The fact that he, had killed millions and millions of his countrymen and had basically wiped out the Soviet military and naval leadership, which, by the way, was part of the reason they had problems early in the war, was really glossed over for most of the American people. There was a picture of the Russians. There were movies, that were, developed that showed the Russians and the Americans being on the same side. But historians are also arguing about the fact that the atomic bomb was dropped for any number of reasons: to end the war, to save lives, but also, in some people's minds, to tell the Russians we had the bomb. In 1950, just several months before the North Koreans attacked, the United States National Security Council came out with a document that said, we've got to stop Russia. We've got to stop them, and we need to expand our budget significantly. The problem was, as Truman told them, I don't have the money. And then the North Koreans came over the parallel. It basically proved to American policymakers that communism was on the rise everywhere, and if you didn't face them with a ring of alliances such as NATO and SEATO and the Rio Pact and ANZUS, all right, then you were going to have significant problems. So in one sense, it was the classic Cold War attack. And of course, it's one of the few times in history of the United Nations was able to agree that aggression had occurred. And even though 90% of the troops were American, the United Nations, there were some forces from other countries. The irony is the Americans thought that almost every activity, whether it was in Greece or Turkey or Korea, was directed from Moscow. The fact of the matter is that Stalin did not have that type of tight control over any of the societies that were involved, the Greek Communist Party or the North Koreans. So it was a shock to the American people, but once again, they saw it as an ongoing battle. By 1950, the United States and Russia were as strong enemies as they were going to get. The Cold War was really cold by 1950, and the American people at the beginning of the war, were supportive of it. And again, as in all our conflicts, as time goes on, all right, if the conflict is not brief, if there are not relatively few American casualties, and if the goals are not clear, then support is going to wane. Most people don't realize that at the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, most people in the United States were in favor of it. We all can remember the beginning of the Gulf War. Most Americans were in favor of it. As it became longer, as American casualties increased, as clear goals became unclear or didn't exist, the support seemed to wane. And that was also true in World War II. By 1945, the vast majority, not the vast majority, but many of the American people were tired of conflict. So Korea was a kind of clear, absolute chapter of communist and, in our minds, Russian aggression. In many ways, Americans don't think about Korea because it's between World War II and Vietnam. World War II being the greatest conflict we've ever been in, and Vietnam being such a situation. In terms of Korea, the distance, the fact that it kind of just ended, and in fact it hasn't ended. It's, there's an armistice in place technically, and also because, at least in theory, it was a UN action in Korea. And it was 3 years as opposed to a very intense, 4 years in World War II. And you could argue the Vietnam conflict began in 1950 when Truman set up a military advisory group and ended in 1975 when Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese. So the conflict, where it was, the fact that it was at least technically under the United Nations, the fact that in some people's minds, which is a terrible thing to say because there still were a significant number of Americans killed in that combat, but fewer than there were in Vietnam, and obviously much fewer than there were in World War II. You don't have as many people who knew somebody who died in the Korean conflict. So it's just a case of where, in some people's minds, it's a blip on the radar. They did not come back victorious, but in many people's minds, they had come back having done a noble thing for liberty and for the American way. That the optimistic way of looking at things, again, was that they had stopped communist aggression in its tracks, that the North Koreans had not succeeded in taking over the South, and that therefore this was in some ways, especially from a military standpoint, you know, the soldier in the front lines was a success. So they were assimilated back fairly quickly and fairly easily. And again, just like after World War II, the GI Bill was a tremendous help in terms of doing that. The GI Bill was very helpful to this university, particularly after World War II, but also after Korea. Many GIs went back to school and were assimilated into the society. So I would think it was probably more like World War II than Vietnam, but not quite as enthusiastic. And they would say it was a war that taught us a number of things, and a war that we didn't learn from in some ways. Whether he actually said it or not, General Omar Bradley, a five-star general, has been quoted as saying it was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemy. And after Eisenhower said we should never again engage in a land war in Asia. And of course we do. We don't learn that lesson in going into Vietnam. Now there are two very different conflicts. But engaging an Asian country in combat in which they're defending their own soil, at least part of the conflict, is not a good idea. It's not a good idea either theoretically, it's not a good idea practically. So the Americans really didn't have much of a choice. And the reason they didn't was because it was a brazen act of aggression. The greatest American event of the war, other than Inchon, was a retreat. The Americans were trapped at the Chosin Reservoir, the Marines, and the Marines fought their way out to the coast. And it almost has to be one of the great stories in American military life. The general said, we're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction. And the Americans get to the coast and they're rescued, by the Navy. But that's a great stirring story in Marine Corps lore. The people who did it were called the Chosen Few. All right, playing playing on that word. So I think historians see as not having a real option in terms of dealing with it. Perhaps hoping that the United Nations would have gotten more involved, but why should they? If we were going to do it, why should they commit their troops to it? Which is understandable. So, but they would also say it was the forgotten war, and probably part of it is because we forgot some of the lessons when we got involved again in Vietnam.